The rope bit into her wrists, a familiar pain that had long ago turned into a dull, permanent ache. Dust, the color of rust and regret, settled on her bare feet, caking between her toes. She was tied to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square, a splintered monument to forgotten horses, and now, to her, the sun beat down, a merciless hammer on the anvil of the day, and she kept her eyes fixed on a loose board in the saloon porch across the way. To look at the faces was to invite them in, and there was no room left inside her for anything else. They murmured. The sounds swirled around her like flies, thick and greasy. Words she'd heard before, words that had stripped her down to this post, to this moment. The respectable women, bonnets shading their judgment, whispered behind gloved hands. The men, leaning against storefronts with whittling knives and lazy eyes, made their own assessments, coarser and louder. She was a curiosity, a piece of damaged goods put out for display. She felt their stares like a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. But her face remained a blank map, revealing no landmarks of fear or shame. She had learned long ago that a void could not be harmed. A man named Blevins, whose sweaty hand had tied the knot that held her, stepped forward. He was a man made of cheap whiskey and loud pronouncements, his belt straining against a belly full of entitlement. He gestured to her as a farmer would a barren mule. He spoke of contracts broken, of debts owed. He was selling her time, her labor, her presence, to whoever would pay the price he'd lost. The crowd shifted, some losing interest, the spectacle growing stale. The sun was hot, and their own lives, however small, demanded their attention. At the edge of the dust-blown circle, a man stood apart from the others. He did not lean or whisper. He just watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the fidgeting crowd. He wore a coat the color of the dirt, frayed at the cuffs, and boots that had walked 1,000 desolate miles. His name was Silas, though few in the town knew it. He came in for supplies twice a season and left without a word more than was necessary. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that others instinctively avoided. He watched the woman at the post. He saw not the shame the town tried to plaster on her, but the rigid line of her spine. He saw the way she didn't flinch when a clod of dirt, thrown by a boy, struck the wood near her head. She was like a solitary fence post in a blizzard, enduring, not yielding. He saw the faint, bruised shadow on her ankle, the way she favored her left foot even when standing still. A subtle limp, a story told in the body that the mouth would not speak. Blevins was growing desperate, his voice taking on a whiny edge. A strong back for the winter, $10 for the season. Silence answered him, thick and heavy as wool. The price was too high for a problem. Silas took a slow step forward, then another. The dust barely stirred beneath his worn heels. He stopped before Blevins, his shadow falling over the smaller man. He did not look at Blevins. His gaze went to the woman, a quiet, assessing look that held no pity, only recognition. "I'll take her," Silas said. His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together under a current. It was a sound that had not been used for conversation in a long time. Blevins blinked, surprised. "Silas? What use you got for? You owe me for that seed grain." Silas cut him off, his tone flat. "From 2 springs back." Blevins's face soured. "That was a bad year." "This clears the slate," Silas said. It was not a negotiation. He reached into his coat, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a small, worn knife. He walked to the post, ignoring the sudden, renewed interest of the crowd. He stood before her, and for the first time, she lifted her gaze from the wooden porch and met his. She saw the winter in his eyes, but she also saw that it was a quiet winter, a place of deep, unbroken snow, not a raging storm. He didn't speak. He simply lifted the knife. The rope was thick, fibrous. He sawed at it, his knuckles brushing the raw skin of her wrist. She did not pull away. The fibers groaned and then snapped. He moved to the other wrist and did the same. The ropes fell away into the dust. She rubbed one wrist with a numb, trembling hand, the feeling returning like a rush of pins. He stepped back, giving her space. He turned and started walking, not looking back to see if she would follow. He knew she would. There was nowhere else for her to go. The crowd parted for him, their murmurs now laced with a grudging respect or simple confusion. He was a man who acted, who ended things. She took a hesitant step, her ankle protesting with a sharp throb. Then another. She followed the straight line of his back out of the town, leaving the whispers and the stares to fester behind them. The dust of the road lifted behind them like ghosts. The journey was a long, silent procession. The sun crawled across the sky, and the landscape stretched out, vast and indifferent. It was a hard country, all cracked earth and tenacious scrub, the wind a constant, sighing presence. Silas walked at a steady, deliberate pace, never once turning to check on her. Yet she felt his awareness of her. He had shortened his usual long stride just enough that her limp did not force her to fall behind. Hours passed. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a space they both seemed to understand. It was not a silence to be filled with nervous chatter, but a silence to be inhabited, like a room. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked parchment. He stopped. Without a word, he unhooked the canteen from his belt. He didn't hand it to her directly. He set it down on a flat, sun-bleached rock between them and then turned his back, looking out over the plains as if finding something of great interest in the haze of the horizon. It was a gesture of profound tact. He gave her the water, but he also gave her the privacy to be thirsty, to be desperate without an audience. She picked it up. The metal was warm from the sun, the water inside blessedly cool. She drank slowly, carefully, feeling the life seep back into her. When she was done, she placed the canteen back on the rock. He waited a moment more before turning, picking it up, and continuing on his way. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The contract of this journey had been written in that single, quiet act. Dusk was painting the sky in bruised colors of violet and blood orange when they finally saw it. His home. It was less a house and more a part of the landscape, hunkered down against a low rise as if bracing itself against the wind. The wood was weathered to a silver gray, the roof patched in places. A curl of smoke, thin as a thread, rose from the stone chimney. It was a place of solitude, a fortress of isolation. It was a perfect reflection of the man who led her to it. On a small, grassy knoll just above the house, a single marker of pale stone stood against the darkening sky. It was simple, unadorned, but the ground around it was clear of weeds. He didn't look at it as they passed, but she felt his awareness of it, a quiet, constant hum beneath his silence. He pushed open the heavy plank door. It swung inward without a sound, well-oiled and cared for. The inside was sparse but clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire whispering within it. There was a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a few books and tin plates, and a door leading to another room. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of emptiness, of a space long occupied by only one person. He gestured toward the table. "Sit." She obeyed, sinking onto one of the chairs. Her body ached with a weariness that went bone deep. He moved around the small space with an economy of motion, ladling stew from a pot that had been simmering by the fire into 2 bowls. He set one in front of her, along with a thick slice of dark bread. He sat opposite her and began to eat. She stared at the food. The steam rose, carrying the scent of meat and root vegetables. It was the first real meal she had seen in days that wasn't a handout or a collection of scraps. He ate without looking at her, his focus on his bowl. His silence was an invitation. "Eat. You are safe here." She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled, but she got it to her mouth. The warmth spread through her, a startling comfort. They ate together in the flickering firelight, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire. When they were finished, he took her bowl, washed it in a basin of water, and set it on the shelf. He pointed to the second door. That's your room. The latch is on the inside. I don't lock doors. The last 3 words hung in the air, a promise more solid than any bolt or chain. She stood, her legs stiff. She paused in the doorway of the small room. It held a simple cot with a clean, patched quilt and a small window that looked out onto the vast, star-dusted darkness. She looked back at him. He was staring into the fire, his profile carved by light and shadow, a man alone with his ghosts. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt foreign in her mouth, rusty from disuse. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his eyes still on the flames. She closed the door behind her, and for the first time in more than a year, she did not feel the need to push a chair against it. The days settled into a rhythm, as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They lived in parallel orbits, their lives revolving around the shared sun of daily work. He would rise before the dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the first sound of the day. He would be out in the fields, mending fences that the wind was always trying to reclaim, tending to his few hardy animals. He worked with a relentless, patient energy, as if he were trying to tire out the sorrow that lived in him. She learned the sounds of his labor, the rhythmic strike of his hammer, the low murmur he used to soothe a nervous horse, the scrape of his boots on the porch steps at the end of the day. Her own world was the house. In the beginning, she moved through it like a ghost, tentative and silent. But the house itself, with its quiet needs, drew her out. She swept the floors, the whisper of the broom a comfort. She scrubbed the tabletop until the grain of the wood showed through, warm and clean. She found a stash of mending thread and needles and began to repair his shirts, stitching the frayed cuffs with small, neat stitches. It was an act of quiet conversation. "I am here. I am useful." He never told her to do these things. He never commented on them. He would simply come in from the cold, and the floor would be clean. He would pull on a shirt and the button that had been missing would be there. He noticed every change, every small touch of care she brought to the hollow spaces of his home. A language was being built between them, one made of swept floors and mended cloth, of fresh water left in the bucket and a fire built up against the evening chill. She still limped. The ankle was an old injury, a knot of pain that tightened in the cold mornings. It was a constant, physical reminder of Blevins, of a life she was trying to scrub from her memory. One morning, the ache was particularly sharp. She moved slowly, her face tight with the effort of not showing the pain. Silas watched her from the doorway as she tried to carry a bucket of water from the pump. He said nothing, but his eyes followed the careful, pained way she moved. Later that day, she found a walking stick leaning by the door. It was a piece of sturdy, smooth cottonwood, sanded down until it felt like polished bone in her hand. The top was wrapped in a strip of soft leather for a better grip. He had made it for her. He had seen her pain and answered it not with words of pity, but with a practical, solid piece of wood. She took the stick, and her next trip to the pump was easier. The simple, unspoken kindness of it settled in her chest, a small, warm stone. His cooking was functional, meant for sustenance and nothing more. The stew was filling, the bread dense. One afternoon, she found a small sack of flour he had overlooked. While he was out, she worked it with water and a little salt, her hands remembering motions from a long-ago life. She baked a loaf of bread in the hearth oven. It wasn't perfect, a little lopsided, a little too dark on the bottom, but the house filled with a warm, yeasty smell it hadn't known in years. When he came in that evening, he stopped just inside the door, his nostrils flaring slightly. He looked at the loaf cooling on the table. He looked at her. "Made bread," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He sat at the table and cut a piece. He chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. He swallowed. "It's a little dry," he said. His tone was flat, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, a ghost of a smile. "You didn't complain about mine," he added, gesturing to the hardtack loaf from the day before. "That loaf died in vain," she replied, the words coming out before she could stop them. A genuine, startling sound escaped him. It was a low chuckle, rusty and unused, but it was real. The sound cracked the quiet solemnity of the room. She felt a warmth spread across her cheeks. It was the first time they had shared something that wasn't just silence or work. It was a joke, however small and dry. It was a beginning. One day, drawn by a pull she didn't understand, she walked up the small knoll to the stone marker. It was a woman's grave. Mary. The name was carved deep. Beloved wife. She ran her fingers over the cold letters. She thought of the emptiness in the house, of the unused rocking chair by the fire, of the deep well of winter in Silas's eyes. This was his loss. This was the ghost he lived with. The next day, she returned and placed a single, hardy prairie wildflower at the base of the stone. She did it every day after that. A small acknowledgement of the woman whose place she hadn't taken, but whose absence she now lived within. Silas never mentioned the flowers, but she knew he saw them. She knew because one evening, he came in from the fields and set a small, crudely carved wooden bird on the mantelpiece. It was for her. A gift for a gift. Their routines continued to weave together, the threads growing stronger, stitching their lives together with raw thread. He would fix a loose floorboard that he noticed she tripped on. She would leave a hot cup of coffee on the porch railing for him in the cold mornings. They were building a home not with declarations, but with deeds. The nightmares were old companions. They came on cold nights, whispering things she'd spent the daylight hours trying to forget. One night, a storm rolled in, the wind turning mean and rattling the windows. The sound was too much like shouting, like fists on a door. She woke up with a gasp, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The room was dark, suffocating. The latch on the inside suddenly felt like a trap. She scrambled from the cot, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She had to get out. She fumbled with the door and stumbled into the main room. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. She backed away, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob, and bumped into the table. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun around, her body tensed to flee. Silas stood in the doorway of his own room, a heavy blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He wasn't looking at her with alarm, but with that same steady, quiet understanding. The shadows made his face a mask of concern. The storm, he said. It wasn't a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She was trembling, the fear clinging to her like wet paper. He didn't move closer. He respected the space around her terror. He simply walked to the hearth, added a few small logs to the embers, and gently blew them into life. The flames rose, pushing back the shadows, filling the room with a warm, steady light. He pulled one of the chairs closer to the fire and sat down. He looked at the other chair, then back at her. An invitation. She hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, she crossed the room and sat in the other chair. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the breathing of the fire and the howling of the wind outside. The warmth from the hearth began to seep into her bones, chasing away the chill of her fear. The house felt like a sanctuary again, a ship riding out the storm. He used to lock me in, she said, the words falling into the quiet space between them. They were small and brittle. When he was angry, the dark, it remembers. Silas stared into the flames, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't say it would be all right. He just listened. He let her truth exist in the room, giving it weight and respect. I don't lock doors. He repeated his promise from that first night. It meant more now. It wasn't just about physical locks. It was about the cages people built for each other. She finally found the courage to ask the question that had lived in her since that day in town. Why? She asked, her voice thin. Why did you take me? He was quiet for a long moment, watching the way the fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The town was watching a thing, he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. They weren't watching a person. I saw a person. He turned his head and looked at her, his gaze direct and clear in the firelight. And my fences were in bad need of mending. The last part was a clumsy offering, a way to soften the intensity of the first. It was his way of saying he needed her too, even if it was just for the illusion of practicality. She understood. It was a kindness, a way for her to keep her pride. "My bread is better than your fences," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. He nodded, a flicker of warmth in his wintry eyes. "Yes, it is." They sat there until the storm passed and the first pale light of dawn touched the window. The fear had receded, leaving behind not emptiness, but the solid foundation of a trust that had been tested and held. She had shared a piece of her broken past, and he had not turned away. He had simply added another log to the fire. The piece they had built was fragile, a thin pane of glass against a hard world. They both knew it. The harbinger of its shattering came not as a letter or a rumor, but as two riders silhouetted against the morning sun, dark shapes on the crest of the hill that overlooked the ranch. Silas saw them first. He was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a part of the morning song. He stopped mid-swing, the axe held motionless in the air. His body went still, a stillness that was not calm, but coiled. She was coming from the chicken coop, a few precious eggs in her apron. She saw the direction of his gaze and followed it. Her breath caught in her throat. The sight of riders on the horizon sent a cold spike of dread through her. For months, this small patch of land had been the entire world. Now, the outside world was coming to reclaim its property. She knew, with a certainty that made her stomach clench, who it was. She walked to his side, the eggs forgotten. She didn't have to ask. The rigid set of his jaw told her everything. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat and hard. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the approaching figures. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid as the ground beneath her feet. It was the voice of a woman who had found a place to stand. He glanced at her then, a quick, sharp look. He saw the fear in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a spine of steel he had only glimpsed before. He gave a curt nod. There was no time to argue. This was not his fight alone anymore. The riders came on slowly, with the lazy confidence of men who believe they hold all the cards. As they drew closer, she confirmed her fear. The man in the lead was Blevins, his face puffy and flushed with cheap arrogance. The man beside him was the town sheriff, a tin star pinned to his dusty vest. The law had come with him. Her heart sank. The law had never been her friend. They stopped a few yards from the house, turning the land before the porch into a battleground. The sheriff, a man named Cutler with weary eyes and a drooping mustache, looked uncomfortable. This was not a duty he relished. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice carrying on the still air. "Blevins here filed a complaint. Says you took his property." Blevins smirked, his gaze sweeping over her with a familiar sense of ownership that made her skin crawl. "Not took," he corrected, his voice slick. "Stole. She was contracted to me." He cleared a debt of grain, not a legal contract for a servant. "I want her back," he said, her, as if he were talking about a stray cow. Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He was a rock against which Blevins's greasy words washed over and broke. "She's not property," Silas stated, his voice a low rumble. "She's a person. And she's not going anywhere." "Now, Silas," the sheriff began, shifting in his saddle. "The law is the law. If there was a contract—" "There was no contract," she said. All three men turned to look at her. It was the first time she had spoken directly to her tormentor in their presence. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and cold. Blevins's smirk faltered. He had expected the silent, broken thing he had tied to a post. He did not recognize this woman. "I was left in that town with nothing," she continued, taking a step forward, no longer standing behind Silas but beside him. "He claimed a debt my husband owed him, a debt of labor. My husband is dead. That debt died with him. This man," she gestured to Blevins, "put me on display for his own spite. There was no contract. There was only cruelty. Blevins' face darkened with rage. You lying. She's right, Cutler. Silas cut in, his eyes locked on the sheriff. You were there. You saw it. Was that the law? Or was that a man humiliating a woman who had no one to stand for her? Sheriff Cutler had the decency to look away, his gaze falling to his saddle horn. He remembered the scene well, the town's casual cruelty.
Silas' qui est intervention.
He had done nothing then. He had let it happen. His silence had been complicity. That ain't the point, Blevins snarled, recovering his bluster. She's mine. I paid her passage. I fed her. She owes me. He started to swing down from his horse, his intentions clear. He was going to take her by force. Silas moved then. It was a simple, fluid motion. He stepped directly in front of her, blocking Blevins' path. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. His entire being was a weapon, a shield of absolute refusal. You will not touch her. Get out of my way, you crazy old hermit. Blevins spat, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. But before he could draw, another movement caught his eye. The woman, the object he had come to reclaim, had bent down and picked up a piece of split firewood. It was a heavy, dense piece of oak. She held it in both hands like a club, her knuckles white. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fire he had never seen before. She was terrified, but she was ready to fight. She would not be tied to a post again. The sheriff saw it all. He saw Silas, a man of quiet honor, standing guard not over property, but over a person he had given sanctuary. He saw the woman, no longer a victim, but a survivor with a weapon in her hand and defiance in her eyes. And he saw Blevins, a man motivated by nothing more than greed and wounded pride. He saw the home they had made here, a fragile thing built of decency in a harsh land. The choice was suddenly, starkly clear. It was not about a contract or a debt. It was about what was right. Blevins, the sheriff said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the tension. Get back on your horse. Blevins froze, his hand hovering over his gun. What? Cutler, you're the law. You're supposed to be on my side. I'm on the side of peace, the sheriff said, his gaze hard. He looked from Silas's unyielding stance to the woman's desperate courage. He had seen men stand over gold claims with less conviction. What he was witnessing shook him more than any gunfight he'd ever been in. It was a quiet, powerful thing that he had no right to break. And you're disturbing it. This woman has found a home. She's not being held here against her will. You can see that plain as day. She's my. She is not, Cutler said, his voice final. Now you can ride out of here, or I can arrest you for incitement, intimidation, and being a damned fool. Your choice. Blevins stared, his mouth agape. He looked at the sheriff's resolute face, at Silas's stony expression, at the woman holding the log. He saw no weakness, no opening. He was beaten, not by force of arms, but by a moral authority he could not comprehend. With a curse, he pulled himself back into the saddle, his face a mask of impotent fury. This ain't over, he threatened, but the words were hollow. Yes, it is, the sheriff said quietly. He watched as Blevins wheeled his horse around and galloped away, a bitter cloud of dust in his wake. Cutler lingered a moment, tipping his hat. It was a gesture of respect, an apology, and an acknowledgement all in one. He looked at Silas, then at the woman. You folks have a good day, he said, and turned his own horse, riding away at a slow, thoughtful pace. Silence descended again, but this time it was different. It was the silence of victory, of relief so profound it was dizzying. The log slipped from her fingers and thudded softly in the dust. Her legs felt weak and she thought she might fall. Before she could, Silas's hand was there, his fingers closing gently around her arm, steadying her. It was the first time he had touched her with such open, simple care. The warmth of his hand seeped through her sleeve, a solid, grounding presence. I was scared, she whispered, looking at the spot where the riders had been. I know, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. You didn't run. She looked up at him. I had nowhere to run to, she corrected herself. I had no reason to run. This is my home. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in the quiet winter of his eyes, she saw a thaw beginning, a small, hopeful spring. He let go of her arm, bent down, and picked up the eggs that had fallen from her apron. Only one was broken. He carefully gathered the others and handed them to her. They went inside the house together, closing the door on the world, the unspoken threat finally truly gone. That night, the air in the small house was different. The walls seemed to hold not emptiness, but a shared breath. The confrontation had burned away the last of the unspoken questions between them, leaving a clean, quiet space. They sat by the fire, the meal long finished, the silence comfortable and deep. He turned to her, the firelight catching the weathered lines of his face. I never asked your name, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact that had suddenly become important. She had been nameless for so long, a ghost defined only by her past. To speak her name now felt like an act of creation, of claiming herself. It's Lena, she said. Lena, he repeated, tasting the sound of it. It's a good name, he paused, his gaze steady on hers. My name is Silas. It was a formal exchange, a reintroduction. They were no longer just the man who had saved her and the woman who was saved. They were Silas and Lena. The act of naming was a promise, a foundation stone for the future they had just fought for. A few days later, Silas built a fire in a pit behind the house. He came to her holding the ragged, filthy dress she had been wearing the day she arrived, which she had pushed to the back of a small trunk. He held it out to her without a word. She understood. She took the dress. It was a physical remnant of her humiliation, stiff with the dust of that town and the sweat of her fear. Holding it felt like holding a dead thing. Together they walked to the fire pit. She looked at him and he nodded. She threw the dress into the flames. They watched as the fire caught, curling the frayed edges, turning the symbol of her past into smoke and ash that the wind carried away across the prairie. It was a baptism by fire, a cleansing. In the weeks that followed, a new routine settled, one born not of necessity but of partnership. They repaired the section of fence Blevins' horse had trampled, working side by side. He would set the posts and she would hand him the wire. Their hands would occasionally brush, small sparks of contact that spoke more than words ever could. She hung new curtains, made from old flour sacks she had bleached in the sun, and the light that filtered into the house seemed softer, warmer. The house, once a hollow shell of his grief, began to breathe again. It began to feel like a home they were building together, not just one she was inhabiting. The final image of their old life vanishing came one cool evening. They sat on the small porch, a shared blanket across their laps, watching the stars prick the vast, velvet darkness of the sky. The world was quiet, peaceful. The only sounds were the crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the grass. This was their sanctuary, earned and defended. He reached over and took her hand, his calloused palm enveloping hers. It was a simple gesture, but it held the weight of everything that had passed between them. The rescue, the shared silence, the slow blossoming of trust, the stand against the world. It was a promise of all the quiet evenings yet to come. The house behind them was warm, its windows glowing with a soft, steady light. It was no longer a place of ghosts, but a place of life, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest soil, with enough quiet care, something new and strong could grow. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. That's too easy a tale to tell. It's about what happens after. It's about the quiet, patient work of healing. It's about two broken people who, instead of trying to fix each other, simply made space for the other's wounds. They didn't have the words for it. Their love story wasn't written in poetry. It was written in mended fences and baked bread, in a walking stick left by the door, and in the shared silence by a fire. It's a story that says the deepest kindness is often the most unspoken. It's the act of seeing a person when the rest of the world sees only a thing. It's the choice to stand firm, not with loud declarations, but with a quiet and unmovable presence. Silas didn't save Lena from the world. He just opened a door and gave her a place where she could save herself. He gave her a sanctuary where her own strength, which was there all along, could finally take root and grow. So here is your naming. In the quiet corners of your own life, there are fences that need mending. There are silent wounds that need tending. Look for the language that isn't spoken. Listen to the silence and what it's trying to say. True strength isn't always in the shout. Sometimes, it's in the steady hand that offers a cup of water and then has the grace to look away. And if you are brave enough to offer that quiet space, or brave enough to step into it, you might just find that a fire only changes everything if something new and beautiful is waiting in the ash. You might just find a home